Hello, Mount Calvary Church and school friends. I'm Mr. Russell, and it is a blessing to be with you again. Hey, if you don't have a church to virtually tune into today, I'd love to welcome you to join Matt and Jonathan, Ryan, Joe, and myself, and many others as we'll be listening to Mount Calvary's Church's live stream. I'm sure you'll be able to find the address probably somewhere on this Facebook page. Hey, in our study of 1 Corinthians, we've arrived at chapter 12. And what a journey it has been. We started with some greetings and the introduction, and then we moved to some strong theological truth, and then we stumbled into Paul encouraging or challenging the Corinthian church to grow in some pretty specific areas. And today, Paul is turning another page in his letter. And over the next few days, we'll be exploring some key truths about spiritual gifts. In the fall, the Mount Calvary middle schoolers spent some time learning what these spiritual gifts are. But not only that, they also explored how God has uniquely wired them to serve his kingdom in their families, in their churches, and in God's work at large. And there are a few things that get me more excited than seeing teens that understand how God has wired and gifted them and then using them in the church, or more likely this season, in their homes. Now I will say 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 11 is a tricky passage. People have debated many things in these verses. Instead of answering all of these fascinating but rabbit trail questions, we want to make sure that we grasp the main idea of Paul's passage here. As we get started today, I was wondering if you ever used something for a totally different purpose than it was intentionally made. One time when I was growing up, I used some WD-40 to build a blowtorch. Now that was a great idea in the moment until something's caught on fire that probably shouldn't have. I should have used it for its intended purpose. Now we recognize this principle throughout all of life. When you buy medicine or pretty much anything else, the instructions first tell you what to use it for and then how to go about using it in a safe and helpful way. As we read 1 Corinthians 12, the first 11 verses, we see that Paul will give the Corinthians a short tutorial on how to correctly use God's spiritual gifts. I think that this is unbelievably relevant to us today. God has purposefully gifted you and I to do his work in our churches and in our homes. And before we go on, here's a quick definition of spiritual gifts. They are unique spiritual abilities that God has given to individuals for the purpose of growing his cause in the world. Today and in the next few days, actually, we'll see that there's more to it than that definition, but for now, that's a good place to start. So let's dive into the text. We see in verse 1 some of Paul's passion. It says in 12 verse 1, he does not want them to be uninformed concerning spiritual gifts. Literally, he does not want them going around being ignorant. Spiritual gifts are important. They are the tools that we have been given to play our role in God's army well. Paul will continue by pointing out the origin, the purpose, and the meaning of these spiritual gifts. Let's start with the origin of spiritual gifts. Paul says that although there are different giftings, there is one Spirit, the Holy Spirit, that empowers all of them. Just like there are thousands of different cars, they're all powered by the same smelly liquid sold at gas stations. In the same way, every single spiritual gift runs on the power of the Holy Spirit. Now that's pretty cool. That means that your ability to show wisdom, to give, to teach, to lead, and so on, is because the Holy Spirit himself is working through you. Next, Paul describes the purpose that spiritual gifts have. And he does that in verse 7. He says in verse 7, for each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. So your spiritual gift was given to you for the good of those around you, specifically for your local church and your family. Now just as a side note, verse 7 starts with, to each have been given. We are all, in that sense, needed for God's kingdom work. Now, as you read through the list of these spiritual gifts as follows, you might notice some interesting things. In verse 8, he talks about wisdom and knowledge, but then he continues and he mentions some things about prophecy and healing and miracles and distinguishing spirits and eventually speaking in tongues. Now, why is he doing that? Well, in short, as a church and as a school, we believe that those were gifts that God gave the church for when it first got started. The apostles' ministry was filled with these amazing gifts to kickstart the work of the church in the world. And as the church, the worldwide church, transitioned to a new season in the second half of the first century, these unique or apostolic gifts slowly left us. And as we've said when we started, we are simply listening into Paul's letter to the Corinthian church. We're not the first audience. Is that a little confusing? Yes. But does the principle about the Holy Spirit's gifting for us still stand? Absolutely. So we've talked about the origin and the purpose for these spiritual gifts. And we have one more point to go. In the final verse, verse 11, we read that the Holy Spirit apportions to each one individually as he wills. Now, if you're anything like me, you sometimes look at some Christians and think, wow, I wish I had that gifting, or I wish I had more of that type of gifting. But Paul would say, no, you're entering into the Holy Spirit's territory when we do that. Like an amazing general, he gives each soldier the right equipment for battle. And just like a desert soldier needs to be happy not getting a fur coat, so we need to accept what God's Spirit has gifted us for his kingdom efforts. Hey, before you click away, just 2 questions for us to think about throughout our day. First, what are my spiritual gifts? Now, there are some helpful tests out there, but the best way to find out what your gifting is to try different service opportunity, but also to find someone in your home or church that knows and loves you well and ask them, what is my spiritual gifting? Second question is this: how do I use them for good in this context? Life right now is very different than it was, but the need for your spiritual gift that God has given you has not shrunk, it has grown. So what are my spiritual gifts, and how can you put those gifts into practice today?